So there are two options that exist for connecting remote virtual networks or on-premise networks to the Azure cloud, and those are VPN gateways as well as ExpressRoute. They both obviously are going to have their advantages and disadvantages. ExpressRoute primary advantage is going to be in low latency, but the disadvantage will be the cost. VPN gateways are very easy to set up and have various SKU levels that you can use depending on the level of performance that you require. So let's start with VPN gateways. A VPN gateway is definitely the easiest method of connecting remote networks with Azure VNets. And as I said, it's available with different SKUs, so various cost levels, including a free level that's intended for non-production. It's basically just a special type of gateway that's used to send encrypted traffic from point to point between Azure and over the, to an on-prem location over the public internet. Now, technically, you could use it to send traffic to other virtual networks that Microsoft maintains, maybe in regions and whatnot. But most of the time all the time when I've set this up, it's been directly to an on-premise environment. Okay, so the VNet gateway contains two or more virtual machines that manage routing tables and that run gateway-specific services in a subnet that is actually called the gateway subnet. Okay, now these VMs are created automatically when you create the virtual network gateway, and you don't configure them at all. Okay, so all you're basically doing is creating that subnet. Gateways can be deployed in Azure availability zones, which gives you, of course, resiliency, scalability, high availability, etc. And that would physically and logically separate the gateways within a region. Now, there are three different kinds: site-to-site, connecting on-premise networks to Azure; VNet to VNet, which would be a custom; and then you have a point-to-site, which is a user VPN or client VPN. This is if you want to offload your VPN infrastructure from the local on-prem network and instead have people directly connecting to the cloud to then access Azure VMs in a more private way. So let's talk first about the site-to-site connections. This is done predominantly in Azure, and these are the high-level steps. We'll also kind of walk through how we do this. But the first step would be to create the virtual networks and subnets. And we've already done that. We understand the concept. But we need to create these subnets with the on-prem network in mind. Okay, so we need to make sure that our address ranges kind of correspond with one another and that there are no conflicts. An optional step is to specify a DNS server. It's not required to create a site-to-site connection, but if you need name resolution for resources that are in the virtual network, you probably should. And then we have the creation of the gateway subnet. Okay, so up to this point, this is actually the first step. So before you create your virtual network gateway, you create this gateway subnet, and it contains the IP addresses that are used by the virtual network gateway. Now, typically we create this as small as possible. So CIDR block of 28 is good and still provides enough addresses to accommodate future configuration requirements if you want. It also must be named gateway subnet. There are some oddities here. This is for the VMs that are deployed and configured, and remember, we don't manage those, so we will not deploy any other resources to the gateway subnet, and it needs to be called gateway subnet. All right, then the next step would be to create the VPN gateway, and there are a number of settings in here that are going to be pretty critical. The region is important from performance perspective. The gateway type or VPN type is going to be just VPN or ExpressRoute, but then beyond that you have route-based versus policy-based. And most VPN types are going to be route-based. It actually depends on the make and the model of the VPN device, and Microsoft has a document that can tell you what is and what is not supported. But typically it is going to be route-based, especially if you need IKEv2. So Ike v2 VPNs are only supported with route-based VPN gateways. That's a key point to remember. Then the SKU, the gateway SKU will affect the number of tunnels you have. It's going to affect your throughput and efficiency. It's not guaranteed because you're using the public internet, but it attempts. So the higher you go in SKU, the higher the cost, but the more throughput you can expect. And of course, in the planning documents, it tells you all about that as well. Generation is another one, Generation 1 or Generation 2, and that'll depend on the SKU, and then the virtual networks. So all of that's a part of the VPN gateway. The next step is to create the local network gateway, and that is what refers to your on-premise location. So you give the site a name in Azure, and you kind of go from there. You also specify the IP address prefixes that are on that particular network, so that we know how to route, right? So it makes sense. We create gateway subnet, we create the Azure VPN gateway, then we create the local representation, and then now we're down to actually configuring the on-prem device. So the on-prem VPN device will have to be configured with the public IP address of the gateway and a shared key, which is a key that you'll create when you set up that VPN gateway. After we've done that, we can just create the VPN connection within Azure, and we'll verify that, and then we can analyze and test connectivity from there. Another option that we have with VNets and virtual networking in Azure is a VPN gateway, which is a connection back to on-premises environments to allow organizations to create hybrid environments where some of their resources are in Azure. And we have a lot that are doing this with WVD environments. We have backup domain controllers in the cloud for some organizations. We have SQL Service databases and web app servers being deployed to the cloud. You can even deploy an Exchange server in Azure, although I've never run into that in the real world. So all of those are possibilities. The VPN gateway is the primary means by which we get this done. Let's see, the Azure, well, why is that not showing up? Virtual Network Gateway, that's my fault. I always call it a VPN gateway, we all do, but it's a virtual network gateway in here. Okay. So the steps to creating the connection to the on-prem environment are to first create a virtual network gateway. We're going to deploy this in our East US region. Notice I don't get to choose a resource group because I'm going to choose a virtual network, and that will determine it. Route-based versus policy-based, VPN versus express route. So we're going to do VPN, we're going to do route-based. The SKU is the type that you're doing. So you do have basic and VPN gateway 1. You really need to look these up in implementation. You don't need to know these for the exam, but in their implementation, we need to understand, okay, what are the capabilities of this? VPN gateway 2 and beyond are going to support IKE v2 VPNs. And so that's what we want. We do have the generation. And then we've got the virtual network that this is going to be utilized. Now, let's see, cannot be associated with the virtual network gateway. So pick VNet 2. It is going to create a gateway subnet. And so this is the gateway subnet range. You can kind of decide what you want that to be. It doesn't really need to be that large. In fact, we could probably just do like a 29, okay, which is going to give me 8 addresses, which is enough. Create a new, so VNet gateway public IP. And then the public IP address SKU, which probably doesn't matter. These are typically not done. We don't need any metadata, so it's going to go ahead and create that virtual network gateway. All right, so once the VPN gateway is created, and that is a fairly long, we didn't make you watch the whole thing, but it is probably about 10 minutes before it is all said and done, and that actually gets deployed. And then once that's the case, your next step is going to be to create a local network gateway. All right. So, basically we create the virtual network gateway first, then we go and create a local network gateway. The local network gateway actually references your VPN device. It's a firewall or VPN or whatever it happens to be. So I'm going to just say like Meraki on-prem. Okay. You can specify an IP address that we want to use. Address space if necessary. Resource group you want to deploy this in, most likely just the same one, or the VPN resource group that you've created. And location, and then we just hit create. Okay. Now, mind you that we are going to have to stop short on this demonstration because I don't actually have an on-premises Meraki that I can go and connect to. But we're still just kind of walking through the process. So now I'll go back to my virtual network gateways. Okay. So here we've got our VNet gateway. We've created the local one. And then I'll just go down to connections. And in connections, I'm going to hit add. And we're going to add Azure to site. Okay. What connection type is this? VNet to VNet or site to site or express route. We specify the VNet gateway. We specify the local network gateway. We then specify a pre-shared key. Okay, obviously that's fake, but you would need to configure that on both sides. And then IKE v1, v2. You definitely want to use v2. You want to try to make sure that your firewall or VPN supports that. So we'll just hit OK, and then that would create the connection. Now, technically, right before we did that was where we should have gone and configured the on-premises appliance, because I would have had to create a connection to the public IP of the virtual network gateway, a site-to-site VPN, and I would have had to configure a pre-shared key. So then I would come and just mimic that here. The local gateway was already configured, but the pre-shared key is configured in the connections. What's then going to happen, and this looks like it's still deploying, but what then is going to happen is you are just going to get that to show up in here, okay? And it'll say status unknown, or it'll say status connecting, or ideally, it'll say status connected. And that means you actually do have a site-to-site VPN configured. Again, that point we won't be able to get to, but we still saw the process. So you create the VNet gateway, which creates the gateway subnet. We create the local network gateway, which references an on-premises device. We then go configure the on-premises device with a connection to Azure, to the public IP, and a pre-shared key. And then finally, we go in here and we actually create the connection, which establishes a site-to-site VPN. So those are the steps that you can use to create an on-premises network to the Microsoft Azure cloud. Now, another route we have is, no pun intended, is the express route option. This is another option for connecting to your on-premise networks, and this one is facilitated by a connectivity provider. So these are the primary benefits for this is that it's a private connection between Azure data centers and your on-premise or in some sort of colo environment. So these don't actually go out over the public internet, and they're more reliable, they're faster, have lower latencies than your typical internet connection. So if we need very high-speed access, then ExpressRoute would probably be the way to go. We actually have bandwidth speeds up to 100 gigabits per second with the ExpressRoute. So it helps us to utilize pretty much any of the scenarios, whether it's backup recovery, storage, an extension of the data center, hybrid applications. All of those things can be supported with ExpressRoute due to the higher throughput. Of course, with the higher throughput is going to come increased cost.